Everyone on that plane assumed the tired woman in worn sneakers didn't belong in first class. She carried a battered duffel bag. Her uniform still smelled like coffee and kitchen grease, and she sat with a Belgian Malinois pressed against her leg like she was afraid someone would take him. People stared. Someone actually laughed. A flight attendant arrived within 4 minutes to ask her, politely, then not so politely, to relocate. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just picked up her bag, clicked her tongue twice for the dog, and moved to the back. What nobody noticed was the man in the aisle seat across from her, a decorated Navy commander who had gone completely still the moment he saw the dog's collar tag, and the name burned into it that he hadn't heard in 6 years. If this story reaches you wherever you are, please follow along to the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The flight was supposed to be routine. That was what Olivia Hart told herself when she booked it. A red-eye from Galveston to Washington, D.C., the cheapest seat available, which turned out to be in first class because of a last-minute airline points redemption she'd been sitting on for 3 years and finally used because she had to get Titan to his medical evaluation before the end of the month. She hadn't thought about the optics. She never did. She bought the ticket, printed the boarding pass, packed Titan's water bowl and medication in the duffel next to her spare shirt, and got to the gate 40 minutes early the way she always did, out of habit from a life she no longer talked about. Titan was 9 years old, which was old for a Belgian Malinois, and the gray along his muzzle had spread since spring. He walked with a slight hitch in his right rear leg, an old injury that had never fully healed, and when Olivia sat, he lowered himself to the floor beside her with the slow, deliberate care of a dog that had learned to be careful with his body. He put his head on her shoe. She reached down and rubbed the base of his ear, and he exhaled through his nose, a long, tired sound, and closed his eyes. She'd had him for 3 years. Technically, she hadn't adopted him so much as he'd selected her, which was a story she'd told maybe twice, and which she still wasn't entirely sure she had the right words for. The gate agent called first-class boarding, and Olivia stood, slung the duffel over one shoulder, and followed the short line down the jetway. The seat was 3A window. She got Titan settled, tucked the duffel under the seat in front of her, and leaned her head against the cold plastic of the window frame. It was 11:40 at night. She'd worked a double shift at Hargrove's Diner that morning, 7 to 7, breakfast and lunch crowd, and before that she'd been up at 5 to give Titan his joint medication and wait for it to settle before walking him. She was tired in the specific, dense way that had become her default state over the past 4 years, a tiredness that sat below the level of sleep and couldn't quite be fixed by it. She didn't notice the couple boarding until the woman spoke. "Excuse me." The voice was the particular kind of polite that isn't actually polite, clipped and high, with the assumption of agreement built in. The woman was maybe 55, in a camel coat, with the kind of highlighted hair that required monthly maintenance. Her husband was behind her, already scrolling his phone. "Is that animal going to be in this cabin?" Olivia looked up. "Yes. He's a certified service animal." Service animal. The woman said it the way someone repeats a phrase they're skeptical of. "For what condition exactly?" "I'm not legally required to answer that." The woman's jaw tightened. She looked at Titan, then at Olivia's uniform. The black polyester slacks and white button-down that was technically her Hargrove's uniform, but that she'd kept on because she hadn't had time to change. Then back at Olivia's face with an expression that completed a full assessment in about 2 seconds. "I see," she said, and sat down in 2A and 2B with her husband. For a few minutes it was quiet. The cabin filled. Olivia closed her eyes. She heard the call button chime. She didn't open her eyes. It wasn't her problem. She was a passenger. A flight attendant passed. Then voices, low and pointed. She caught a phrase, "The dog is shedding," and opened her eyes in time to see the attendant. Young woman, dark blazer, name tag reading Petra, coming toward her with an expression of practiced neutrality. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to bother you. We've received a concern from another passenger about the animal in the cabin. He's a certified service animal. I have his documentation in my bag." "Of course, and I'm sure that's all in order." Petra's hands were clasped in front of her. "The concern is actually about allergens. One of our first-class passengers has indicated a dog allergy, and our policy does allow us to ask if you'd be willing to relocate to economy." We have some very comfortable seats available in... Does your policy actually require me to move, or are you asking me to volunteer? Petra hesitated. That hesitation lasted about 3 seconds longer than it should have, and it told Olivia everything. I'm asking, Petra said carefully. Olivia looked at her. Titan had raised his head at the sound of the voices and was watching Petra with calm, dark eyes. Not aggressive, just attentive, the way he watched everything. Okay, Olivia said. She stood. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't say anything to the couple in 2A and 2B, didn't look at them, didn't pause. She collected her duffel, clicked twice for Titan, and walked toward the back of the plane, while people in first class watched the whole thing the way passengers watched delays, with mild interest and no real discomfort, because it wasn't their problem. She didn't see the man in 4C stay very still. Commander Ethan Caldwell of the United States Navy had been in seat 4C for 11 minutes when the woman and the dog boarded. He was not technically supposed to be on this flight. He was traveling under modified leave arrangements, which was the administrative way of saying that he had argued with 3 different senior officials over the past 2 weeks about a classified report and had been told, politely but firmly, to take some personal time and let the situation settle. He'd spent 4 days at his sister's place in Galveston and was now heading back to D.C., not because anyone had called him back, but because he was incapable of letting things sit. He had a drink he wasn't finishing, a briefing document he'd already read 4 times, and the specific restlessness of a man who was very good at his job and currently not allowed to do it. Then the woman boarded with the dog. He wasn't looking at her specifically. He was looking at the dog the way he always looked at Belgian Malinois, with the involuntary, searching attention of someone who had known several of them well and lost one badly. The dog was older, moving carefully, gray around the face. Well-trained, clearly, the kind of composure that took years to build. Then the dog passed close enough that Caldwell could see the collar. It was a standard military-issue K9 collar, worn smooth from years of wear, with a small metal tag on the front ring. Most working dogs had ID tags. This one had 2, the standard ID and a second tag, smaller, engraved with a name. The name was Titan. Caldwell's hand, resting on his armrest, went absolutely still. There were, he was aware, multiple military dogs named Titan. It was not an uncommon designation. He knew this. He told himself this in the 2 seconds between seeing the name and standing halfway out of his seat before he forced himself back down. But the tag, the shape of it, the specific worn metal, the font of the engraving. He had seen that tag before, in photographs, in a mission file, in a briefing room where he had sat with 6 other officers and been told that K9 Unit Titan, Handler Sergeant Ryan Whitfield, had not been recovered from the field, that the mission had been flagged classified, that the woman who had carried the dog out of the engagement zone, a combat medic whose name appeared once in a field report before being redacted, had never been publicly identified. He sat in his seat and watched the woman with the dog settle into 3A, and then watched, without expression, as the woman in 2A got a flight attendant involved, and then watched, still without expression, as the woman with the dog collected her bag and walked to the back of the plane without argument or complaint. Titan glanced at Caldwell as they passed. The dog held eye contact for a moment longer than a dog typically did with a stranger. Caldwell looked away first. He ordered another drink he wouldn't finish and spent the next 20 minutes trying to decide whether he was about to do something very smart or very stupid, and concluded that those 2 things had never, in his experience, been mutually exclusive. Olivia's seat in economy was 27F middle. She had the window seat beside her empty for about 3 minutes before a large man with a laptop bag sat in the aisle seat and immediately colonized both armrests. Titan fit in the space at her feet, but it was tight, and he was too old for tight, and Olivia could feel him adjusting his position every few minutes, trying to find something that didn't put pressure on his hip. She didn't sleep. The cabin lights dimmed. The flight attendants did their rounds. Olivia ate the small pretzels from the snack bag and drank the ginger ale she'd asked for and watched the darkness outside the window and tried very hard not to think about Washington. The medical evaluation was at the National Canine Veterans Center on Thursday. She'd taken 3 days off from the diner, a conversation that had required more negotiation than she wanted to admit, and she was staying with her friend Dara, who lived in Arlington and had a small apartment and a smaller patience for dogs on the furniture, but who had offered anyway because that was the kind of person Dara was. The evaluation was a routine thing, annual checkup, standard for retired military working dogs. She did not think it would be routine. Titan had been sleeping more. The hip was worse. He'd had 2 episodes in the last month where he'd been difficult to rouse, not unconscious, just deeply, stubbornly asleep in a way that felt wrong. The vet in Galveston had ordered blood panels and adjusted his medications and used the phrase monitoring closely with the particular careful cadence of someone who was not ready to say the other thing yet. She pressed her thumb against the base of his ear and felt him exhale. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." She'd had dogs she cared about before. She'd been a medic. She knew the math of attachment, knew what you were signing up for when you let something into that particular part of yourself. She'd done it anyway. She always did. It was one of the things about herself she hadn't managed to change in the post-military years of conscious self-improvement. She was incapable of keeping a useful distance from things she'd decided to love. The man in 4A turned on his overhead light and opened a bag of chips. The crinkle of the bag seemed very loud. Olivia pulled her hood up. She was nearly asleep when the footsteps stopped next to her row. She opened her eyes. The man standing in the aisle was wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray sweater. But he stood the way military men stood, weight balanced, spine easy. The particular posture of someone who had spent years having to be ready to move quickly and had never entirely stopped. He was mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just authoritative. He was looking at Titan. "That's a military working dog collar," he said, low enough not to carry. Olivia sat up. "Lots of people use that style." "Not with that tag." He met her eyes. "Can I sit down?" She didn't move. "There's nobody in the window seat." He slid in without another word, and for a moment they just sat there, 3 across, with Titan between them on the floor, and the man looked at the dog with an expression that was doing a lot of work. "His name's Titan," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Where'd you get him?" Olivia turned her head and looked at him directly. He had the eyes of someone who already knew a version of the answer and was checking it against what was in front of him. She recognized the look. She'd been looked at that way in debriefing rooms. "A rescue placement," she said, 3 years ago, through a veterans program in Texas." "Did they tell you his history?" "Some of it." The man was quiet for a moment. Below them, Titan had lifted his head, and he was looking at the man with that same calm attention he'd given the flight attendant, but different. Something about the set of his ears, something about the way his tail moved, once, carefully. "His handler was Sergeant Ryan Whitfield," the man said, 43rd Special Operations Unit. He died in a classified engagement in 2018. The dog was listed as unrecovered. Olivia said nothing. "He was recovered," the man continued, "by a combat medic who pulled him out of a burning vehicle under fire and carried him approximately 400 meters to extraction. That medic's name was removed from the after-action report. The record shows an unidentified field medic, female, designation unknown." He paused. "That was 6 years ago. And right now I'm looking at a dog who spent 3 years refusing to bond with anyone after Whitfield died. And here he is, on the floor with his head on your shoe." Olivia looked at Titan. He had indeed put his head back on her shoe. "He picked me," she said. "I didn't go looking for him." "I know. I was the one who arranged the placement." She looked at the man. "Commander Ethan Caldwell," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He seemed to understand she wasn't in a handshaking mood. "I was the operations officer on the mission where Ryan Whitfield died. I've spent the better part of 4 years trying to find the medic in that report." He stopped. "I wasn't expecting to find her being asked to give up her seat in first class." The silence between them was the kind that had weight. "What do you want?" Olivia asked. "Right now?" He looked at the dog, then at her. "I want to know if he's okay. He was moving strangely when you boarded. His hip, old injury. He's got a vet evaluation Thursday." "I know." He looked up. The National Canine Veterans Center arranged it. I called them last week after I found out where he'd been placed. He paused. I didn't know who you were then. Not your name. Just the placement address? Olivia stared at him. You've been tracking him. I've been making sure he had what he needed. His voice was completely level. Ryan Whitfield was my best officer. That dog was everything to him. When I saw the mission file, when I saw what the medic had done, who did that and didn't get credit for it, I made it my problem. Yes. She didn't say anything for a long time. The plane hummed around them, the low, constant white noise of 30,000 feet, and outside the window there was nothing but dark. The man, Caldwell, sat with the stillness of someone who was comfortable waiting, and Olivia had the unsettling sense that he had been building up to this conversation for a long time. I'm a waitress, she said finally. I know what you do now. I also know what you did then. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said. They're not. He looked at her steadily. But one of them is why that dog is still alive. Something passed over Titan's face. A flicker of something, a dog dream twitch. And Olivia reached down automatically, the way she always did, thumb pressing behind his ear, and felt him settle. I don't want anything from the Navy, she said. I left. I made peace with that. I'm not here on behalf of the Navy. Then what are you here for? He was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I just wanted to see if it was really him. He looked at Titan again, and if the person who saved him was who I thought she was. And? Caldwell looked at her. A full, direct look, the kind people didn't often aim at her anymore, as if she'd become the kind of person who blended into background noise. Yeah, he said quietly. It's her. Olivia said nothing. She looked out the window at the dark. Her coffee was cold. Her back hurt from the economy seat. Titan breathed slow and steady against her shoe, and for a moment, nothing else moved. Then Titan's breathing changed. It was subtle. She felt it before she heard it, a slight catch in the rhythm, a hesitation between exhales that was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately explain, but that her body recognized before her brain did. She was already moving, already leaning down, when the second breath came. Labored, wet-edged, audible. Titan. She was on the floor, economy class floor. She didn't think about it. She had her hands on him, on his ribs, feeling the rise and fall, and what she felt underneath that was not good. What's wrong? Caldwell was down beside her in a second, and she would think later that it said something about him that he didn't hesitate either. His breathing is compromised. She was already pulling his collar aside, checking the lymph nodes along his jaw, running her hands down his spine. How long has he had the hip injury? Since the mission, 2018. Did anyone run imaging after he was placed? Recent imaging? I don't know. I'd have to check the... It doesn't matter right now. She had her ear at his chest. The heartbeat was there, fast but present. His gums were a shade lighter than they should be, and she pressed the heel of her thumb against them and watched the capillary refill and counted. 1, 2, 3. Too slow. He's in respiratory distress, she said, not loudly, just stating it. I need to know if there's an oxygen kit on this aircraft, not the passenger masks, the medical kit. Does this carrier maintain a veterinary emergency pack, or just the human FAA kit? Caldwell stood. He was already looking for a flight attendant. I need the cabin crew, he said, and his voice carried in a way that the voice of someone used to command carries. Not loud, not aggressive, but with a quality that made the nearest attendant, a young man 3 rows up, turn and come immediately without being waved at. Olivia did not look up. She was tracking Titan's breath, counting the intervals, her hand flat against his side. The dog looked at her. His eyes were tired but clear, and there was something in them she recognized from the only other time she'd seen it in him. A trust that was absolute and had been earned in the worst possible way, in smoke and heat and blood, 400 meters of her arms telling him, I have you, I have you. And now here he was again, on a plane floor in the dark over the Atlantic corridor, trusting her with the same certainty. I've got you, she said, low and steady. You hear me? I've got you. The flight attendant arrived. A few rows of passengers craned their necks. Caldwell was already asking about the medical kit, and Olivia was already cataloging what she'd need, and the 30,000 feet up with 2 hours to landing and a dog who was struggling to breathe, she did what she had always done when things went wrong in dark places. She got to work. The young flight attendant, his name tag said Marco, came back with the medical kit in 90 seconds flat, which was faster than Olivia expected, and she had it open before he'd finished apologizing for the delay. The FAA mandated kit wasn't designed for dogs. She knew that going in. What she needed was in there anyway, partially. A pediatric oxygen mask she could modify, a small bag valve setup, epinephrine she wouldn't use unless things got significantly worse. She pulled out what was useful, set aside what wasn't, and kept her hands moving because stopping to think was a luxury she didn't have. "Is he going to be okay?" Marco asked. "Not sure yet. I need space." He stepped back. Caldwell had already created space, not obviously, just by standing slightly wider than necessary, enough that the passengers who'd begun to lean into the aisle found themselves blocked without being told to move. Titan was breathing, which was the most important thing. The distress hadn't worsened in the last 2 minutes. She fit the pediatric mask over his muzzle. Imperfect, too wide, but she held it with one hand and angled it to direct the flow, and connected it to the portable oxygen cylinder from the kit. His ribs expanded and contracted. The wet sound in his breathing hadn't disappeared, but it had stabilized, which was different from improved, and she wasn't going to confuse the two. "His airway's partially obstructed," she said, mostly to herself. "Old scar tissue, maybe, or fluid." She adjusted the mask. "Has he been coughing recently? Before tonight?" "I wouldn't know." Caldwell's voice came from above her right shoulder. "I wasn't asking you." She glanced up at Marco. "Did you see him cough when you walked past earlier before boarding at the gate?" Marco shook his head. "I wasn't at the gate. I'm sorry." She nodded once and went back to Titan. He was watching her. He always watched her. It was one of the things about him that had undone her early on, the sheer, undeflectable attention of a dog who had decided she was the center of his world. Right now it helped. As long as he was watching, he was present. "Stay with me," she said. "You're okay." He blinked, slow and heavy, and exhaled through the mask. The passengers who'd been craning their necks had mostly retreated into their seats, but a few remained. A woman in 25C holding her phone, clearly trying to decide whether to record this. A man across the aisle who'd put his magazine down. A child in the row behind peering over the seat back. Olivia was aware of all of them, the way she was aware of ambient noise in any environment, cataloged, filtered, present, without demanding attention. What demanded attention was Titan's pulse, which she took manually at the femoral and which was still too fast. "He needs imaging," she said, "as soon as we land." "I know someone at the NCVC who will meet us at the gate if I make a call," Caldwell said. "Make it." She heard him move toward the back of the plane, toward the area near the lavatories where cell use wasn't going to annoy anyone. She stayed on the floor with the dog and the kit and the low drone of the engines and let herself do the thing she was good at, which was this: waiting in the middle of a crisis without panicking, monitoring every variable she could track and letting go of the ones she couldn't, and talking to whoever was in front of her in a low, steady voice because it helped both of them. "You picked a terrible time for this," she told Titan. "Middle of the night, 30,000 feet, no actual equipment. Classic." He made a sound against the mask that was almost a sigh. "I know. Me too." Net. Caldwell was back in 4 minutes. "Dr. Renata Osei will have a mobile unit at the arrival gate," he said. "She's the head vet at the NCVC. I served with her husband. She'll come." "Good." Olivia was tracking the capillary refill again. Better. Still not ideal. 90 minutes to landing? 83. Okay. She exhaled slowly. "He's stable. I don't want to move him more than necessary." "What happened to him back in 2018? To the hip?" She looked up at him briefly. "Vehicle impact. Secondary explosion threw him about 12 feet. He landed wrong." She looked back at Titan. His handler tried to get to him before the second detonation, but didn't make it. Caldwell said nothing for a moment. Ryan was a good officer, he said. His voice was level, but it cost him something. I know, I talked to him for about 40 seconds. She paused. He was trying to go back for the dog. I had to physically pull him away from the access point, and then the second one went, and that was... She stopped. He died about 20 minutes after extraction. There wasn't anything I could have done differently. I know that too. People don't always know that. I reviewed your field report, Caldwell said. Everything you did was textbook. Better than textbook. You performed triage on 3 personnel and a K9 under active fire with 2 broken fingers on your offhand, and you carried that dog 400 meters without putting him down. That's not in dispute. Olivia looked up at him. Then what happened to the report? She asked. He held her gaze. That's a longer conversation. I've got 83 minutes. He crouched down, which put him closer to her level, and she understood it as a deliberate choice, not comfortable for a man his size on a narrow aircraft floor, but done anyway. The mission was part of an operation that got complicated politically, he said. The unit's presence in that region was under a specific authorization that had not been fully disclosed to oversight. When the after-action came in and it was clear there had been casualties and an asset, Titan, had been involved in a way that would raise questions, the reporting chain decided to simplify. Simplify, she said flatly. Redact. Classify. Remove specifics that would require explanation. He looked at the dog. Your name was among the specifics. Olivia was quiet for a moment. On the floor, Titan's breathing had settled into something more like a rhythm, still not good enough, but consistent. Did you know? She asked. Not when it happened. I was stateside for the initial reporting. By the time I reviewed the full file, 2 years had passed and the record was already set. He paused. I pushed for a correction through proper channels. And I was told the matter was closed and to focus on my current assignment. She nodded slowly, the way she did when she received information that confirmed something she'd already suspected at a cellular level. I left 8 months after that mission, she said. I put in my separation papers and I didn't appeal anything. I just left. I know. I wasn't... She stopped herself. I wasn't bitter about it. I want to be clear about that. I didn't leave because I felt wronged. I left because I couldn't figure out how to keep doing it. The thing that happened with Ryan, with Titan, that was just the end of a long process. She looked at her hands, resting now on Titan's back, rising and falling with him. I needed to stop. I understand that, Caldwell said, but what they did to the record... Something moved across her face quickly. That's different. That's not about me. That's about Ryan. About who was there. About what actually happened. She looked at Caldwell directly. His family doesn't know, does it? What he did at the end? Yes. No, Caldwell said. They were told he died in a training accident. The engagement was classified. The silence that followed that was the kind with edges. Olivia said, Training accident. Yes. She looked at the ceiling of the aircraft for a moment. When she looked back down, her expression had changed. Not harder exactly, but more settled the way a person looks when they've just located something they'd lost and found it exactly where they'd feared it might be. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay? I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know, not now, after we land and Titan's been seen. She adjusted the mask. But everything. Agreed, Caldwell said. Seb. They held position on the floor for the rest of the flight. Marco brought them water. Neither of them drank, and checked in every 15 minutes with the careful attentiveness of someone who didn't know what else to do and was coping through small acts. The woman in 25C had put her phone away after Olivia had looked at her once, not threatening, just direct. The specific look of a person who has more important things to think about than your documentation of her emergency. The child behind them had fallen asleep. Caldwell stayed. He didn't fill the silence with commentary or reassurance, which she appreciated. He sat against the seat base, legs in the aisle because the space was too tight, and he watched Titan the same way she did, not hovering, just present. She noticed he had a small scar along his left jawline that disappeared into his collar, the kind of scar you got from something fast and close. She didn't ask. Around what she estimated was the 1-hour mark, he said, "How long have you been waitressing?" 4 years. Do you like it? She considered the question, which was more sincere than she expected. I like that I can leave it at the door, she said. When my shift ends, it ends. I don't carry it home. And before you did? Always. She looked at her hands. You don't stop being a medic, even off duty. Every time I was in public, I was scanning, exits, injuries, who looks wrong. It's exhausting. She paused. Waitressing is just coffee and the specials and whatever the customer actually meant when they said no onions, but they clearly can't have forgotten they said no onions. Something in Caldwell's expression shifted. It wasn't quite a smile. My sister waitressed through law school, he said. Said the same thing, minus the tactical scanning. Smart woman. She'd agree with you. It was the kind of exchange that didn't mean much and somehow still managed to say something. Olivia let it sit without following it up. She had enough to carry right now. The descent began somewhere around the 40-minute mark. She felt the pressure change in her ears, felt Titan's breathing shift in response. Not worse, just different, his body responding to the altitude drop. She increased the oxygen flow slightly and kept her hand on his ribs and talked him through it the way she talked patients through procedures. Not asking if they were okay, which was a useless question, but just giving them something to track. A voice to follow, a current in the dark. Almost there, she told him. 40 minutes, maybe 35. You're going to make it, and then Dr. Osei is going to look at you, and she's going to tell me something I don't want to hear but that I already know, and then we're going to figure out what to do about it, together, like we always do. Titan's tail moved, once and then again, slow but present. Yeah, she said, together. Plus, the landing was hard. A crosswind that caught the aircraft on approach and required a correction that jolted everyone forward in their seats. And Titan made a sound, low and involuntary, when the impact rattled through the floor. Olivia had her hands braced on him before the sound stopped. I know, she said. I know. I'm here. She was still on the floor when the plane taxied to the gate. She was still there when Marco came back and told her very gently that she might want to stand. And she told him very politely that she was going to stay right where she was until the jetway was connected. Thank you. And she felt rather than heard Caldwell say something to Marco that made him nod and step back. When they finally opened the forward door, she heard Caldwell on his phone giving someone a description of Titan's symptoms in the precise, abbreviated language of someone who knew how to convey medical information quickly without emotion. She was already getting Titan to his feet, carefully, slowly, one hand under his chest and one along his flank, when the forward door opened and the first passengers began to file off. The couple from 2A and 2B passed her row. The woman glanced down. Her eyes went from the oxygen kit to Titan to Olivia on the floor, and something moved through her expression that Olivia couldn't categorize and didn't particularly want to. I hope he's okay, the woman said. Olivia looked up at her. He will be, she said. Nothing else. The woman and her husband moved on. Olivia looked back at Titan. Okay, she told him. Let's go. Getting him down the jetway was slow. His legs were cooperative but unsteady, and she kept her hand on his collar and moved at his pace, which was somewhere between deliberate and painful to watch. Caldwell walked on his other side, not touching the dog but close enough to catch him if something went wrong. They made an odd group moving through the jetway. The attendant, the commander, the woman in the waitress uniform with the oxygen kit borrowed from the flight medical bag, and the other passengers parted without being asked. Dr. Renata Osei was at the gate. She was a compact Ghanaian woman in her mid-50s, wearing street clothes and a medical bag over one shoulder, and she was already crouching to meet Titan before Olivia had finished descending the jetway steps. She ran her hands over him with the specific, purposeful touch of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years, checked his gums, checked his eyes, pressed lightly along his rib cage, and looked up at Olivia with a question in her face. Respiratory distress, onset sudden, in flight, Olivia said. Stabilized with supplemental oxygen approximately 80 minutes ago. Capillary refill was at 3+ when I first assessed, down to 2 by the time we landed. Heart rate elevated throughout. His last blood panels were 3 weeks ago, and I've got copies on my phone. Osei held her hand out for the phone. Olivia unlocked it and handed it over without comment, watched her scroll through the lab results, watched her face. "When did this hip injury first present?" Osei asked, still reading. 2018, combat. Osei looked up then, at Olivia, not at Caldwell. Something passed through her face quickly. "You're the medic." Olivia blinked. "Caldwell told you?" "Ethan told me enough." Osei stood, handing the phone back. "We're going to need imaging tonight. I have a mobile unit in the van." She was already in motion, bag in hand. "What I saw in the bloods is consistent with early-stage cardiac involvement secondary to the chest injury. He's been compensating for years. The hip presentation is a distraction. The real problem is in here." She laid 2 fingers briefly on Titan's chest. "But he's stable and he's tough, and I've seen worse come through." "Is he going to be okay?" Caldwell asked. Osei gave him the look of a woman who had been answering that question for 3 decades and had never found a fully honest way to make it land softly. "He's going to get the best possible care. That's what I can promise you right now." They followed her through the terminal toward the ground transport exit. It was past 1 in the morning and the terminal was half populated. Cleaning crews, overnight travelers, a group of men in matching sports team jackets asleep across 3 rows of seats. Their footsteps echoed. Olivia kept her hand on Titan's collar. She was aware, distantly, of how she must look. Uniform wrinkled, knees marked from the aircraft floor, hair loose from the ponytail she'd started the night with, carrying borrowed medical equipment and trailing a Navy commander through an airport at 1 a.m. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, noted, filed, irrelevant to anything that mattered. What mattered was the dog at her side, breathing. What mattered was the information sitting in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying since a debriefing room 8 months after an engagement she'd never been allowed to name out loud. That the mission was classified, that the record had been altered, that the family of Ryan Whitfield had been told their son died in a training accident, and that nobody had thought that required correction. What had changed in the last 3 hours was that someone else now knew what she knew, and that someone had rank, and that for the first time in 4 years, Olivia Hart was not the only person in the room who had a reason to care about what the record actually said. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. They reached the exit. The automatic doors slid open into the warm Washington night, exhaust and damp pavement, and Osei's white medical van was parked at the curb with its side door open and the portable imaging unit glowing inside. 2 techs were already waiting. Titan stepped up into the van with help and settled onto the padded surface with a sound that was neither good nor bad, but just tired. Osei began her assessment. The techs moved with practiced efficiency. Caldwell stood at the van's side door with his arms loosely crossed, watching, and after a moment he said quietly to Olivia beside him, "I need to make another call in the morning." "To who?" "Admiral Marcus Voss." He paused. "He was the commanding officer for the operation in 2018. He's the one who signed the classification order." Olivia looked at him. "And what are you going to tell him?" Caldwell turned his head and looked at her directly. And there was something in his face now that was different from the measured, contained expression he'd been running since the moment he crouched down beside her on the aircraft floor. Something older and more settled, the look of a man who had made a decision that had been a long time coming. "I'm going to tell him I found the medic," he said, "and that she's not going to stay hidden anymore." Inside the van, one of the techs called for Osei, and the tone of it was not the routine tone. Osei moved quickly to the imaging screen, studied it for a moment, and said something under her breath that Olivia couldn't hear. Then she turned. "Ms. Hart," she said, "I need you to come look at this." Olivia climbed into the van. The imaging screen showed Titan's chest cavity in clean gray-white cross-section, and she had enough medical training to read what she was looking at before Osei said a word. And what she saw made her stomach drop in a way she hadn't expected, because she'd been braced for bad news, and somehow this was still worse than she'd braced for. "That's not from 2018, she said. "No," Osei said quietly. "That's recent. Within the last few months, I'd estimate. And it's why he nearly stopped breathing on that plane." She pointed to the lower right quadrant of the scan. "This fragment. It's been migrating." Olivia stared at the screen. All those nights she'd heard him adjust his position in the dark. All the days she'd chalked up to the hip. All the careful morning routines and the extra medication and the vet appointments and the monitoring closely. And underneath all of it, something she hadn't been able to see. Something that had been moving toward the worst possible place for 6 years, quiet and invisible, waiting. "Can you remove it?" she asked. Osei was quiet for one beat too long. "That," she said, "is a conversation we need to have with the full surgical team, tonight." Olivia looked at Titan. He was looking back at her, tired and trusting and completely, devastatingly calm. And she had the specific feeling she'd had once before, on a stretch of burning ground in a region that had no name on any map she was allowed to carry. That she was the only thing standing between him and whatever came next. And that the only thing she could do was exactly what she'd always done. She put her hand on his side. "Okay," she told him. "Okay?" Outside the van, she heard Caldwell on his phone. "Marcus," he said, "it's Ethan. I need you to listen to me very carefully." The call lasted 6 minutes. Olivia could hear none of it clearly. She was inside the van, watching Osei's tech set up the portable ultrasound to complement the imaging, and Caldwell's voice came in fragments through the open side door, low and controlled, the tone of someone being very deliberate with every word. She heard classified record once. She heard 6 years twice. She didn't hear what came back through the phone, but she could read the quality of Caldwell's silence when he listened, and it was the silence of a man hearing something he'd expected and was still angry about. Osei was running the ultrasound paddle along Titan's sternum with her left hand and writing on a notepad with her right, left-handed notes, abbreviated in a system that was clearly personal and not taught in any school. One of the techs, a young woman who hadn't introduced herself, was managing the imaging display and adjusting contrast settings without being asked. The other tech, older, male, was prepping a tray that Olivia recognized as a pre-surgical layout and doing it with the efficiency of someone who'd been told not to wait for the conversation to finish before getting ready. Olivia looked at the tray. "You're already preparing for surgery," she said. Osei didn't look up. "I'm preparing options." "The fragment is that close to the pericardium?" "Close enough that if it shifts another 4 to 6 millimeters in the current direction, we're talking about a different outcome entirely." Osei set the paddle down and turned to face her fully. The respiratory episode on the plane was likely a precursor event. The fragment moved, probably when the aircraft hit turbulence or during the hard landing. The body compensated, this time. She held Olivia's gaze. "I can't promise it compensates a second time without intervention. What are the risks of the surgery?" "For a 9-year-old Malinois with a compromised cardiac history?" Osei tilted her head slightly, the gesture of someone who was about to give an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "Real. Anesthesia risk is elevated. The fragment's position requires accessing the pericardial space, which is not a simple procedure. If he's strong enough to tolerate it, the prognosis post-removal is significantly better than leaving it. If he's not..." She stopped. "I need 2 hours to run a full panel and assess his cardiac function before I can tell you where we are." 2 hours. At minimum. Olivia looked at Titan. He was lying still under the ultrasound, patient as he always was with medical handling. Battlefield-trained patience. The specific learned stillness of a dog who had been through worse than this and emerged. His eyes were tracking Olivia across the van, steady and dark. "Do what you need to do," Olivia said. She climbed out of the van. Caldwell was standing 3 feet from the bumper, phone at his side, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone reordering a set of facts they'd been living with for a long time. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he was surprised to hear from me at this hour." A pause. "Then he said he wasn't sure what I was referring to. He denied it. He redirected, which is not the same thing but achieves the same result over the phone." Caldwell looked at her. "He'll be in Washington tomorrow. He had a meeting already scheduled at the Pentagon. I told him I needed 20 minutes of his time. And he agreed? He didn't have a clean way to say no without it becoming a thing." Something in Caldwell's jaw tightened briefly. "Marcus Voss has been very good, for 28 years, at not having things become a thing." Olivia crossed her arms. The night air was warm and damp, the way DC got in summer, and the airport access road behind them was quiet except for the occasional ground vehicle and the distant percussion of a plane on final approach. She was tired in a way that had passed through exhaustion and come out the other side into something flatter and more functional. "Tell me about the operation," she said. "The full version." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure you want to do this tonight?" "I've been waiting 6 years. Tonight is fine." He nodded once. He didn't sit. Neither of them did. They stood beside the van while Osi worked inside it, and he told her. The operation had been designated Hollow Pine, a joint special operations task with a 6-person ground element and 2 K9 units, inserted into a region of active conflict to locate and extract a signals intelligence asset who had gone dark. The mission had a classified authorization level that required specific congressional oversight notifications, which had been, in the language of the report, deferred pending operational security review, which was the administrative phrase for not done. Ryan Whitfield had been the K9 handler for the element. He and Titan had been together for 3 years at that point, one of the longest handler-dog partnerships in the unit's recent history, which meant they moved like one thing rather than two, which meant Whitfield trusted the dog's read on an environment the way he trusted his own instincts, maybe more. The asset extraction had gone wrong in the second hour. The signal's intelligence turned out to be a different kind of signal, a draw, a provocation, something designed to identify who was looking. The element was engaged from 3 sides, 2 personnel down in the first exchange. Whitfield was hit in the lower back and went to ground, but he was mobile. He was still directing Titan through hand signals, and for approximately 11 minutes he held the eastern approach with the dog working ahead of him, clearing positions, until the secondary device detonated. Titan had been within 6 feet of the vehicle when it went. The blast threw him. Whitfield tried to reach him. The third detonation occurred before Whitfield reached the dog's position, and Whitfield did not survive the third. Olivia, who had been with the rear security element, came forward when the primary medic went down in the first exchange. She triaged in sequence, most critical first, stable last, and got 3 personnel to the extraction point before going back for Titan, who was alive but not moving, and she had carried him the remaining distance to the extraction helicopter with one hand because the other had 2 broken fingers from a fall in the debris field, and she needed the damaged hand free to maintain pressure on the neck wound of the man she was also somehow half carrying. She knew all of this. She'd lived it. What she hadn't known, what Caldwell was telling her now, was what happened after. The after-action report had been written by a senior officer who had not been present at the engagement. The narrative was constructed from survivor accounts and, critically, from the operational authorization documents that the command chain needed to protect. The unauthorized oversight deferral created a liability exposure that someone in the reporting chain had decided to manage by simplifying the record. The engagement was reclassified as a training accident. The K9 was listed as unrecovered, and the personnel who could have complicated the narrative, the combat medic who had been present for the full sequence and whose name appeared once in a field account, was removed from the official record by the simple mechanism of not being named at all. Ryan Whitfield's family received a folded flag and a story about a training accident and a missing dog. When Caldwell finished, the silence between them was thick. "Who signed the reclassification?" Olivia asked. Her voice was even. Admiral Marcus Voss countersigned. The primary order came from above him, but his signature is on the document. And he knew it was false. Caldwell looked at her. He knew the training accident narrative was a cover. Whether he understood the full extent of what was being removed from the record, he stopped. "I don't know. I've spent 2 years trying to figure out how much Marcus knew versus how much he chose not to look at. Is there a difference?" He was quiet for a moment. "Legally, yes. Morally?" He shook his head. "Not much." Inside the van, Osei began running the cardiac panel at 2:17 in the morning. Olivia sat on a folding chair outside the van's open door, watching without being in the way, and Caldwell brought 2 coffees from somewhere, an airport vending machine from the look of the cups, and she took hers without thanking him, which he didn't seem to require. Her phone showed 3 texts from Dara. "Landed yet? Then, okay, I'm going to assume you're not dead and go to sleep." She sent back a quick message. At hospital, Titan emergency, I'm fine. And put the phone away. She thought about Ryan Whitfield's family. She didn't know them. She'd never met them. What she knew about them, she knew from 40 seconds of conversation with Ryan in a vehicle bay 3 hours before the mission when he'd been rechecking Titan's nowhere. My dad used to say that dogs are the only honest thing left, and she'd said, "Your dad sounds smart," and he'd said, "He's the kind of smart that comes from losing things." And then the vehicle had moved and the conversation had ended. She had thought about that exchange a lot in the years since. His family had been told a training accident, 6 years. They'd been carrying a story that wasn't true, a death that had been stripped of its actual shape, a missing dog that was apparently unrecoverable. And somewhere in the ordinary machinery of a cover designed to protect an authorization document, that family had lost not just their son, but the truth of how he'd gone. That, more than anything else, was the thing she couldn't set down. "I want to be in the room when you talk to Voss," she said. Caldwell looked at her over his cup. "That may not be. I'm not asking for permission." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you what I need. You can decide whether that changes your plan." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Mtek." Osei came out of the van at 4:30. She was carrying her notepad, and she had the expression of someone who had finished a calculation and was deciding how to present the result. Caldwell stood. Olivia stayed sitting, which was a choice about stability more than composure. "His cardiac function is better than I expected," Osei said. "He's compensated more effectively than most dogs his age would. The fragment is the primary concern and it has to come out. That hasn't changed. But his body is in better condition for surgery than the initial scan suggested." She paused. "I want to operate at 7 this morning. That gives his system time to stabilize further from the in-flight event, and it gives me time to get my full surgical team in." 7, Olivia said. "Yes. Can I stay with him until then?" Osei looked at her in the way that doctors and vets sometimes looked at people who asked that question, assessing whether the answer would help or complicate. "Yes," she said. "There's a waiting area inside. I'll have someone check on you both." Olivia nodded. She stood and went into the van to tell Titan she'd be right outside, and she stayed there for a moment with her hand on him, feeling the rise and fall, and she said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, just the contact, just the fact of being present, which was sometimes all there was. Wolves. At 7:45 in the morning, Olivia was sitting in the National Canine Veterans Center's surgical waiting area when Commander Caldwell's phone rang, and he stepped into the hallway and came back 4 minutes later looking like a man who had received news he'd half expected and still wasn't ready for. "Voss moved the meeting," he said. Olivia looked up. "To when?" "To now. He's at the Pentagon already." He paused. "He's also apparently made some calls this morning. My access to the classified filing system was flagged at 6 a.m. His jaw was tight. "He knows I pulled the Hollow Pine file." "He's closing the window," she said. "He's trying to." Caldwell sat down across from her. "I need to go, now before he has time to build a wall around this. Titan's in surgery." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm going to go, and I'm going to put what I know on record formally before he can intercept it. I've already contacted the IG's office, Judge Advocate, Inspector General. The filing goes in the moment I get there, regardless of what Voss says in that room." He leaned forward slightly. "Your name, your record, your field report, what actually happened. All of it, on the record, with my signature." She stared at him. "You're doing this without me in the room." "I'm doing this before the room closes." He stood. "I need you here. Titan needs you here. And honestly," he stopped. "The meeting with Voss will go better if you're not there yet. Let the filing land first. Let him see it before he sees you." A pause. "Because when he does see you, I want it to already be too late for him to do anything about what's on that record." She wanted to argue. She sat with the impulse for a moment and then let it go, because he wasn't wrong. "Go," she said. He went. Titan was in surgery for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Olivia spent the first hour sitting with her spine against the waiting room wall, knees up, the specific posture of someone who has learned to rest in uncomfortable positions because battlefields don't come with chairs. She spent the second hour in the canteen getting food she didn't remember eating and coffee she did. She spent the third hour standing outside near the entrance because the waiting room had begun to feel like a room she was trapped in rather than a room she'd chosen, and the distinction mattered. Her phone rang at 10:12. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. Miss Hart. The voice was older, male, authoritative, in the dense way of someone who had been obeyed long enough that they'd stopped being aware of it. My name is Marcus Voss. She said nothing. I'm assuming that's not a surprise, Voss said. Not particularly. Commander Caldwell has submitted a filing with the Inspector General's office. A pause. I won't pretend I'm not aware of what he's done. I also won't pretend this conversation isn't happening for specific reasons. His tone was even, not aggressive, the tone of a man who is used to managing situations through calm application of authority. I'd like to meet with you, today. You called to ask me to come talk to you. I called because I think there are aspects of the 2018 record that require clarification, and I believe that clarification would benefit from your direct participation. I'm not available today, Olivia said. My dog is in surgery. A brief pause. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Ms. Hart. Something shifted in his voice, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. I understand you have grievances about what happened to your record. I also want you to understand that the decisions made in 2018 were made in a specific context, under specific pressures, and that the people who made them made a choice, she said, to protect a document, and told a family their son died in a training accident. She let that sit. We can have whatever meeting you want, Admiral, but I want you to understand something before we do. Her voice was completely level. I kept quiet for 6 years because I didn't want to fight anyone. I left. I built a different life. I wasn't looking for this. A beat. But I'm not leaving it alone anymore, and neither is Commander Caldwell. And the filing that went into the IG's office this morning has my name on it, whether you meet with me or not. The silence on the other end lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was long for a man who seemed like the kind of person who responded quickly. I'll expect to hear from you, he said. You will, she said, and ended the call. She stood outside in the late morning heat for another moment, phone in her hand, and breathed. Then her phone rang again. This time it was Osei's number. Her chest tightened before she answered. Yes. He's out of surgery, Osei said. The fragment is removed. He's in recovery. Olivia exhaled, a long, ragged sound that she didn't entirely plan. And? He did well, better than my cautious estimate and close to my optimistic one. Osei's voice was careful but warm. The next 24 hours matter, but we got it out cleanly. His heart rhythm stabilized the moment we addressed the irritation, and he's breathing without assistance. Can I see him? I'll come get you in 10 minutes. The 10 minutes passed in a blur. Osei appeared, led her through a corridor and a set of double doors, and into a recovery room that smelled of antiseptic and something warmer underneath it. And Titan was there on a padded surface with monitoring leads on his chest and an IV line in his foreleg and his eyes half open, the specific dreamy, unfocused look of an animal coming up from anesthesia. He heard her before he saw her. His tail moved first, slow, effortful, completely unambiguous. Hi, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. She sat beside him and put her hand on his side, careful of the leads, and felt him exhale. That same long nose exhale, the one he'd been doing since the first week. The sound she'd learned to read as, I'm okay. I've got you in my sights. We're fine here. And she bent forward until her forehead was resting against the side of his neck and stayed there. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't already in the contact. Behind her, Osei stepped quietly out of the room. Olivia stayed like that for a long time, her forehead against his neck, listening to him breathe, and let the last 6 years do whatever they needed to do in the privacy of that room, with nobody watching, before she was going to have to go back out and face the rest of it. She was still there when her phone buzzed. A text from Caldwell. Filing is in, all of it. Your name, your record, the field account, Ryan's family. Voss has seen it. His legal team contacted the IG office 30 minutes ago. They're moving to suppress. She read it twice. Then a second message sent 40 seconds later. There's something else. When the IG's office opened the Hollow Pine file to receive my supplementary submission, they found something already in it. A sealed addendum filed in 2019. I've only seen the header. The name on the addendum is Ryan Whitfield. And the filing officer is someone I didn't expect. Olivia stared at the screen. The recovery room was quiet except for the monitors and Titan's breathing and the distant sounds of a facility beginning its morning and somewhere outside the world doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent, full of things that had been happening without anyone's permission. She typed back. Who filed it? The 3 dots appeared, stayed, disappeared, appeared again. Then, Sergeant Ryan Whitfield's commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel who retired in 2020 and has been off the grid since. A pause. His name is Donald Price, and according to the IG's intake record, he's been in Washington since yesterday. She read Caldwell's last message 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, because her brain was doing the thing it did under certain conditions. The same thing it had done in the field when information arrived that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew, which was to slow down and check every angle before committing to a direction. It was not a calm response. It felt calm from the outside, but on the inside it was a controlled form of urgency, a narrowing of focus down to the single most important question. She typed, "Where is Price now?" The 3 dots again. Then, unknown. IG's office won't release contact information. I'm working on it. She put the phone down and looked at Titan. He was still half under, breathing slow, the monitors showing a rhythm that was steadier than anything she'd seen from him in months without knowing why it hadn't been steady. His tail had stopped moving, but his eyes were tracking her again, lazy and unfocused. The specific gaze of a dog who couldn't quite lift his head, but wanted her to know he was aware she was there. She thought about a man named Donald Price, who had filed a sealed addendum in 2019, a year after the mission, and had been off the grid since, and who was apparently in Washington right now. She thought about what a sealed addendum required. It required a sworn statement. It required a filing officer's identification and signature. It required the filer to appear in person or submit through verified legal representation, which meant Price had either come in himself or had an attorney who knew where he was. It also required a reason. You didn't seal an addendum to a classified file without a specific purpose. You sealed it because you were documenting something you couldn't say openly yet, something you were putting on record against the possibility of a future moment when saying it openly became necessary, or possible, or simply unavoidable. Ryan Whitfield's commanding officer had filed a sealed record a year after Ryan died in a mission that was officially classified as a training accident. She picked the phone back up. Can the IG's office tell you what category the addendum was filed under? Caldwell came back in under a minute. Already asked. Category 7. That's whistleblower protection. She stared at the word. Whistleblower. Donald Price had known. He had known what happened, had known what the record said, and had spent a year after the mission deciding what to do about it, and what he'd done was file a protected statement under a category designed to preserve testimony against the possibility of institutional suppression, which meant he'd also known that suppression was likely, which meant he understood what he was dealing with well enough to protect himself before saying a word, and then he'd gone off the grid for 5 years. Okay, she said aloud, to Titan, to the room, to herself. Okay. She kissed the top of Titan's head, briefly, without ceremony, and stood up. She found a nurse's aide in the hallway and asked to use the facility's telephone directory. She had the name of Price's last known military assignment from the IG header Caldwell had forwarded, and from that she found the name of his retirement processing officer, and from that she found the Veterans Services Coordinator who handled his pension filings, and it took her 40 minutes of phone calls from a hallway chair, but at the end of it she had a name, Eleanor Brask, a legal aid attorney in Arlington who had filed Price's addendum as his representative. She called the number. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, professional and cautious. Brask Legal. My name is Olivia Hart, Olivia said. I was the combat medic present at the Hollow Pine engagement in 2018. I believe your client Donald Price filed a sealed statement in 2019 related to that operation. I'd like to speak with him. The pause that followed was approximately 6 seconds long. Ms. Hart, Eleanor Brask said carefully, I need to ask how you obtained this number. Institutional directory and a lot of patience. Olivia kept her voice even. I understand if he doesn't want contact, but I need him to know that Commander Ethan Caldwell filed a supplementary disclosure with the IG's office this morning. The Hollow Pine record is being reviewed. What Price filed in 2019 may become relevant in the next 24 hours, and he should know that before it does. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll contact my client, Brask said. Do not call this number again. If he wishes to speak with you, you'll hear from us. The line went dead. Olivia set the phone down and sat back in the hallway chair and let herself feel, for exactly 90 seconds, how much she didn't want to be doing any of this. The tiredness from the overnight flight, the hours on the aircraft floor, the waiting room, the surgery, it sat on her like something physical, a weight distributed across her shoulders and behind her eyes. She had not slept. She had eaten food she couldn't remember. Her uniform from the diner was wrinkled past the point of recovery, and she smelled faintly of aircraft air and antiseptic and coffee. And she was sitting in a hallway at a canine veterans facility, while a retired admiral's legal team tried to suppress a classified file, and a man who might be able to unravel the whole thing was somewhere in Arlington choosing whether or not to answer his phone. She gave herself the 90 seconds. Then she stood up and went back in to check on Titan. Caldwell arrived at the facility at 1:15 in the afternoon. He looked like a man who had been in 2 meetings simultaneously and hadn't won either of them. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he'd lost the careful containment he'd been running since the aircraft. Not falling apart, just stripped down to what was underneath it, which was someone who was angry in a specific and directed way and managing it through motion. He found Olivia in the recovery room, and she told him about Brask before he'd finished sitting down. Price had representation, he said. Good representation. She filed under Category 7. He was quiet, processing. He knew enough to protect himself. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. She looked at him. What happened in the meeting? Voss was... He stopped, recalibrated. Voss was exactly what I expected. Calm, cooperative in surface presentation, and working 3 angles at once below the surface. His legal team's motion to suppress is based on an argument that my supplementary filing constitutes an unauthorized disclosure of classified materials, which would technically redirect the IG's review toward my conduct rather than the original record. Can that work? It can delay things significantly. Whether it works long-term depends on whether the IG's office decides to push back or take the path of least resistance. He leaned his elbows on his knees. Voss has been in this building for 30 years. He has relationships. That's not paranoia, it's arithmetic. So we need Price. We need Price, he confirmed. Olivia's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. Unknown number. She answered. Miss Hart. The voice was older, male, with the specific flatness of someone who had spent a long time keeping their register neutral. My name is Donald Price. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. Mr. Price. I've spoken with Eleanor. She told me about Caldwell's filing. A pause. I've been waiting for something to break the surface on this for 4 years. I won't pretend I'm not relieved. Another pause. I also won't pretend I'm not scared because I am, and I think you should know that before we go any further. I understand that, she said. I was Ryan Whitfield's commanding officer, Price said. I was stateside when the mission went. I received the after-action summary 48 hours later, and it didn't match the survivor accounts I'd been getting informally. I pushed for clarification and was told the record was finalized and classified, and that pursuing it further would constitute an interference with an ongoing review. His voice was level, but something ran under it. I knew what that meant. I'd seen it used before. I filed the addendum because I needed something on the record before they could close every door, and then I needed to disappear long enough for the climate to change." "What's in the addendum?" Caldwell said. He'd moved to stand closer when he realized who was on the phone, and Olivia had tilted it enough that he could hear. "Commander Caldwell," Price said, acknowledging him without surprise. "The addendum contains two things. The first is my sworn account of the discrepancy between the official record and the survivor accounts I received, including specific testimony from two personnel who are not named in the official record." A pause. "The second is a copy of the original oversight notification that was never submitted to Congress, the one that was supposed to accompany the mission authorization but was marked deferred and then never filed." The silence in the recovery room was absolute except for the monitors. "You have a copy of the unfiled notification," Caldwell said. "I made 3 copies in 2019. One went into the addendum. One is with Eleanor. One is in a location I won't name over the phone." Price's voice was steady but effortful. "The notification names the officers who signed the deferral. It names the operation. It provides documentary evidence that the congressional oversight was deliberately bypassed, not delayed bypassed, and then the record was altered to prevent the bypass from being discoverable." A beat. "That's not a classification error. That's not a reporting mistake. That is a deliberate obstruction of oversight authority, and the people who signed it knew exactly what they were doing." Olivia sat very still. "Does Voss's name appear on the notification?" she asked. "As a counter-signatory, yes." Price paused. "But he's the third signature, not the first. The first 2 are above his pay grade." "Who are they?" "That conversation needs to happen in person, with legal representation present, and with a recording device running." Price's voice carried a very specific weariness, not defeat, but the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "I'm in Arlington. I've been here for 2 days. I came because I found out through a veterans network that Titan had been placed with someone in Texas. And then I found out about the NCVC evaluation. And I thought maybe the record was finally going to move." Olivia looked at Titan. He was more alert now, lifting his head slightly, watching her with the slow awareness of a dog coming back from something hard. "Come here," she said to Price. "Today." "You're at the NCVC?" "Yes." "I'll be there in an hour," he said. Donald Price was 61 years old, medium height, with the kind of face that had experienced too much weather and too many fluorescent debriefing rooms in approximately equal measure. He walked with a slight forward lean, not quite a stoop, more the posture of a man permanently ready to hear something he wasn't going to like. He was wearing civilian clothes that looked like he'd selected them carefully to look like he hadn't. Khakis, a plain blue shirt, decent shoes. He carried a messenger bag that he held close to his body. He shook Caldwell's hand. He looked at Olivia for a moment before offering his. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I get that a lot," she said. He looked at Titan, who was awake now and watching the new arrival with the careful attention of a dog assessing an unknown. Titan did not growl. He did not approach. He simply looked, and his tail moved once, a single, careful beat. And then he rested his chin back on the padded surface. Price watched the dog for a moment, and something in his face did a complicated thing that he didn't try to hide. "He looks good," he said. "Better than I expected after what Eleanor told me about last night. He's tougher than he looks." "Ryan used to say that." Price's voice didn't break, but it came close to the edge of something. He used to say Titan was the toughest thing he'd ever worked with, and Ryan worked with some very tough things. They moved to the facility's small conference room. A practical space, table and chairs, and a window overlooking a training yard where 2 dogs were running a course with their handlers, the clean, purposeful motion of animals doing what they were built for. Eleanor Brask arrived 12 minutes after Price. She was a precise woman in her early 50s, short dark hair, the kind of professional who set a recorder on the table before she sat down and didn't ask permission, just did it. "For the record," she said, "I'm Eleanor Brask, attorney representing Donald Price. Present are Commander Ethan Caldwell, Ms. Olivia Hart, and my client. Today's date and time are—" She checked her watch and stated them. "My client is prepared to provide testimony relevant to the Hollow Pine classification review currently active with the Inspector General's office. Before he does, I want to note for the record that this testimony is being provided voluntarily and under the protections established by Mr. Price's 2019 Category 7 filing. Caldwell nodded. Understood. Brask looked at Price. Price opened the messenger bag and set a folder on the table. Inside were documents, physical paper copies, the kind that had been handled enough to have slight creases at the corners. He set them out methodically, not slowly, just carefully, the way you handled something you'd been protecting for a long time. The original authorization for Hollow Pine was signed under a Special Operations Emergency provision, he said, which allows for expedited mission approval under specific threat conditions. The provision requires that congressional oversight be notified within 72 hours of the mission's initiation. He tapped the first document. This is the oversight notification form. You can see the date it was generated, 24 hours before the mission launch. You can see the distribution list, the relevant committee members. He turned the page. You can see that the transmission log shows it was never sent. Caldwell looked at the document. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. The form was generated and then held, Price continued. The holding notation is initialed by 2 officers. Here, he pointed, Major General Alan Fitch and Deputy Director of Special Operations Coordinating, Civilian Appointment, a man named Warren Selby. Brask said, both of whom are named in my client's sealed addendum. Warren Selby, Caldwell said, and his voice had a quality Olivia hadn't heard from him before. Flat, pressurized, the tone of a man landing on a name he'd been circling for a long time without quite knowing it. He retired in 2021. He retired, Price said, 8 months after I filed the addendum. Draw whatever conclusion you choose from that. Olivia had been looking at the documents, and now she looked up. Voss's signature is on the 3rd page. Yes. Price turned it over. Voss countersigned the internal record confirming receipt but of the notification, which means he signed a document confirming the notification existed and then either knew it was never sent and said nothing or chose not to verify that it had been sent, which is a different kind of failure with the same practical outcome. He can argue he didn't know it was held, Caldwell said. He can try. Price's voice was even. Eleanor's read on that argument is unlikely to survive scrutiny, Brask said, without looking up from her notepad. Countersigning a distribution confirmation creates a duty of verification. If the notification was never sent, the countersigning officer has an affirmative obligation to have confirmed delivery. Claiming ignorance of non-delivery after countersigning the confirmation is not a defense. It's a confession of negligence at minimum. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, one of the dogs in the training yard completed a retrieve and brought the object back to his handler with the focused intensity of an animal who had found the thing it was meant to do. The handler crouched down and did something that looked like praise, and the dog's whole body moved with it. How long before the IG's office unseals the addendum? Olivia asked. Now that an active review has been opened by Caldwell's filing, they can move to unseal within 48 hours, Brask said. Voss's suppression motion complicates the timeline but doesn't block it. The Category 7 filing creates a protected record that the suppression motion can't reach directly. She set her pen down. What his legal team can do is argue that Caldwell's supplementary filing was unauthorized, which redirects the inquiry and buys time. But if we submit Mr. Price's supporting documentation to the IG's office today as a companion submission to the 2019 addendum, the scope of the review expands to include the oversight notification failure, which is a separate and significantly more serious issue than the record alteration. Separate chain of command, Caldwell said. Correct. The record alteration involves Voss and potentially 1 or 2 others in the reporting chain. The oversight notification failure involves Fitch and Selby, who are outside that chain. The IG's office would effectively have 2 parallel inquiries that can't be suppressed through the same motion. Brask looked at Price. That's the architecture we've been waiting for the right moment to trigger. Price nodded slowly. I built it that way. Olivia looked at him. You planned for this. I planned for the possibility that someone with the right rank and the right reason would eventually push on this from the inside. He met her eyes. I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know it would happen because a dog had a medical emergency on a plane. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, Not quite its opposite. I thought about Ryan's family for 5 years. I thought about what they were told. I thought about the dog they were told was unrecovered. His voice steadied, the way a person's voice steadies when they've made a choice before they know they've made it. I submitted the addendum because I couldn't let the record be the only thing that existed. I needed something true to be somewhere, even if it was sealed, even if no one read it for another 20 years. Olivia said, "Ryan's family needs to know what actually happened." "Yes," Price said, "they do. Before any of this becomes public, before the IG process runs its course and the record gets corrected in some official language that lands on their doorstep without any human being present to explain it." She looked at Caldwell. "Someone who was there needs to go to them." Caldwell held her gaze. "That's you." "I know." Ahmad. Brask submitted the companion documentation to the IG's office at 4:47 that afternoon. Caldwell was copied on the confirmation. He forwarded it to Olivia, who was back in the recovery room with Titan, who had graduated from the padded surface to a proper recovery kennel and had eaten, which Osei had described as a very good sign, in the specifically understated tone of a person who had been genuinely worried and was now allowing herself not to be. Olivia sat beside the kennel with her knees drawn up and her phone on the floor and read the confirmation header twice and then set the phone down and watched Titan sleep. She was still sitting there when Caldwell knocked on the open door at 6:15. "Voss's legal team withdrew the suppression motion," he said. She looked up. 40 minutes after Brask's submission hit the IG's office. He came into the room and leaned against the wall across from her. Once the oversight notification failure was in the record, suppressing the original filing would have left the notification issue visible without any context. His attorneys apparently advised him that the suppression motion was doing more damage than the disclosure. He paused. "The IG's office has opened a full formal review, both tracks, the record alteration and the oversight notification. Fitch has been contacted. Selby's attorney responded within 30 minutes of Selby being notified, which tells you how long they've been expecting this call." "Voss," she said, "placed on administrative leave pending the review." Caldwell's voice was flat. "Pending review means pending review. It doesn't mean the outcome." "But it started." "Yes, it started." He looked at her steadily. "And it won't stop now. The Category 7 protection covers Price, the companion submission is on the record, and Caldwell's supplementary filing has my signature and my rank on it. They can't make any of it disappear." He paused. "What they can do is slow the timeline and push for quiet resolution rather than public accountability. That's the next fight." "Then we fight it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You said we." She looked at him. "Yeah." He nodded once, accepting that. "Get some sleep. There's a cot in the back. One of the staff offered it. You've been awake for what, 30-some hours?" "Close to that." "Price is staying in Arlington. Brask has the documentation secured. The IG's office is working tonight." He pushed off from the wall. "There's nothing you can do in the next 8 hours that requires you to be awake." "There's Ryan's family." "Tomorrow." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "You'll go to them tomorrow." She looked at Titan. He was curled in the kennel, breathing steady, and in the low light of the recovery room, he looked, despite the IV line and the monitors and the close-cropped surgical site on his chest, somehow more at rest than she had seen him look in 3 years. As though something had been removed that she hadn't known was weighing on him. Maybe it had. She reached through the kennel door and rested her fingers against his back. He didn't wake. He just pressed very slightly against her hand in his sleep, the instinctive lean of an animal who knew the touch without needing to open his eyes. "Okay," she said. "Tomorrow." She slept 6 hours on the cot in the back room, and when she woke up at 5 in the morning, she lay still for a moment in the specific blankness that follows deep, exhausted sleep, and then the day's weight returned to her in stages, and she sat up and found her shoes and went to check on Titan. He was awake. His eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen in months. When she came through the door, his tail went immediately. Not the careful single beat of a dog conserving energy, but a proper back and forth, The tale of a dog who has woken up and found something worth waking up for. She sat down beside the kennel and let him push his nose through the door against her palm. "There you are," she said. Osei arrived at 6 with a full update. Titan's cardiac rhythm had stabilized overnight. His oxygen levels were normal. The inflammation around the surgical site was within expected parameters. She used the word promising 3 times and the word cautious twice, which was the balance of someone who was pleased but had been in this work long enough not to lead with certainty. He'll need restricted activity for 6 weeks and a cardiac monitoring protocol for the next 3 months, Osei said. After that, we reassess. But I'm comfortable saying that what we removed last night was the source of the cardiac episodes. Whatever he's been experiencing, the fatigue, the deep sleep, that was the fragment, and it's gone. Olivia absorbed that. He's going to be okay. I believe so. Osei held her gaze. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, just sat with it. Her phone rang at 7:12. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Hart." The voice was female, precise, official. "This is Senior Investigator Dana Wohl with the Inspector General's office. I'm the lead on the Hollow Pine review. I'd like to schedule a recorded statement with you at your earliest convenience." "Of course," Olivia said. "I can come in today." "This afternoon would be helpful. There's a development in the review that requires your direct input, and the timeline is—" A brief pause, the pause of someone choosing their words. "Accelerating." "What kind of development?" Wohl said, "Admiral Voss contacted our office at 6 this morning. He's requested a meeting. He said he has information he'd like to provide." Another pause. "He also said he wants to correct his prior statements regarding the Hollow Pine record." Olivia was quiet. "Ms. Hart, are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'll be there at 2 o'clock." She ended the call and sat in the quiet of the early morning, her hand on the kennel door, Titan's warm breath against her fingers, and looked out the window at a city that was waking up around something it didn't know yet was happening. But before she went anywhere, before the IG meeting, before Ryan's family, before whatever came next in the chain of falling things that had started on an aircraft floor at 30,000 feet, she needed to do one thing first. She took out her phone and typed a text to Caldwell. Wohl called. "Voss wants to talk. He says he wants to correct his statements." The response came in 30 seconds. "I know. She called me too. There's something else. Fitch is not cooperating. His attorney filed a counter-assertion this morning claiming the oversight notification was transmitted and that the transmission record was falsified after the fact by someone else." She stared at the screen. "He's pointing at Voss as the one who falsified it, and he has documentation." She read the message twice and then set the phone face down on the kennel door and breathed. This was what institutional collapse looked like from the inside. Not clean, not choreographed. 2 men with countersigning authority and years of shared culpability, and the moment real pressure arrived, the first instinct wasn't to hold the line, it was to redirect it. Fitch pointing at Voss, Voss rushing to correct his statements. Each of them calculating, in the first hours of a formal review, whether their survival odds were better as a cooperating witness or as a target, and both of them moving simultaneously toward the same conclusion from opposite directions, which meant they were going to collide somewhere in the middle, and the IG's office was going to be standing there when they did. She typed back, "Which documentation does Fitch have?" Caldwell. "Transmission log showing the notification was sent from Voss's office. Dated correctly. If the logs are genuine, Voss received confirmation of transmission and then filed an internal record claiming the notification was held, creating a false paper trail that made the oversight failure look like a deferral rather than a delivery. If Fitch's logs are genuine, Voss didn't just countersign a problematic document, he manufactured the cover." She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, "Are the logs genuine?" A longer pause than usual. "Wohl thinks so. She said they pulled independent server records this morning. The transmission happened. Voss knew. And then Voss created the deferral notation to bury it." She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at Titan. He was watching her with the alert, patient attention of a dog, who had learned over years that when the person he trusted went still like that, something was being decided, and the best thing he could do was be present for it. He made himself the cover, she said. Titan's ear moved. Fitch sent the notification. It went through. And Voss took that record and built a false paper trail on top of it so that if anyone ever looked, it would appear the notification was never sent, which protected the operation's authorization, protected Fitch and Selby, and put the liability for the oversight failure on a document trail that led nowhere. She stopped. And then Ryan's mission went wrong, and people died, and the record needed to be altered to prevent the whole thing from unraveling, and Voss was already practiced at altering records by then. She picked up the phone. I'll be at the IG's office at 1, not 2. If Voss is talking this morning, I want to be in that building before he finishes. Caldwell, I'll meet you there. She asked Osei's staff for a change of clothes, not because she expected them to have any, but because you asked for things when you needed them and let the universe decide. A vet tech named Samara, who was approximately Olivia's height and had been following the events of the last 12 hours with the careful attention of someone who didn't ask questions but noticed everything, appeared at 7:40 with a clean gray shirt and a pair of dark jeans that were slightly too long. Olivia rolled the hems and washed her face in the staff bathroom and pulled her hair back and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked like what she was, someone who had been awake most of the previous 36 hours, had spent a portion of them on an aircraft floor, and was now preparing to walk into a federal building and put 6 years of institutional silence on the record under her own name. She looked also like someone who had decided. She said goodbye to Titan, who pressed his nose against her hand through the kennel door and held it there until she pulled away, and she told him she would be back before tonight, and he looked at her with the specific calm of a dog who had learned, in the worst possible conditions, that she came back. She always came back. So the Inspector General's office occupied the 4th floor of a building on G Street that looked like every other federal building on that block. All authority and no warmth. The architecture of permanence rather than welcome. Olivia arrived at 12:50 and found Caldwell waiting on the steps with 2 cups of coffee, which he handed over without a word and which she accepted without one, and they went inside. Senior investigator Donna Wall was a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the particular efficiency of someone managing 3 simultaneous timelines and not letting any of them show. She greeted them in the 4th floor reception area, shook both their hands, and walked them toward a conference room with the brisk forward momentum of someone who had been waiting for this meeting since 6 in the morning. I want to brief you on where we are before we begin your formal statement, Wall said, setting a thick folder on the table. Admiral Voss came in at 8:30. He provided a 3-hour recorded statement in which he confirmed the authenticity of the transmission logs and acknowledged that the internal deferral notation, the document that made the oversight notification appear to have been held, was created in his office under his direction after the fact. The room was very quiet. He said he was acting on direction from above, Wall continued. He named Selby as the person who instructed him to create the false notation. He claims he was told it was a temporary measure pending a legal review of the authorization, and that he was assured the notification would be formally resubmitted through proper channels once the review concluded. She paused. No resubmission was ever made. He's giving up Selby, Caldwell said. He's providing testimony against Selby, yes, in exchange for consideration in how his own conduct is characterized. Wall's voice was professionally neutral. Whether that consideration is extended depends on the completeness and accuracy of his testimony, which is still being assessed. She looked at Olivia. Your statement today will be part of that assessment. Specifically, the record alteration after Hollow Pine, the removal of your name and field account from the official report, falls under a separate chain of command from the notification failure, and Voss has thus far declined to address it directly. He'll address it when it becomes advantageous to do so, Olivia said. That's a reasonable read. Wall held her gaze. Which is why your testimony needs to establish the record independently, not through Voss's account of events, through yours. I understand. Good. Wall opened the folder. Then let's begin. The statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Olivia had never given this account before. Not the full version, not on record, not with a recorder running and an investigator asking follow-up questions in real time. She had carried it in pieces. The 40 seconds with Ryan, the first detonation, the triage sequence, the broken fingers and the 400 meters and the weight of the dog across her arms. The debriefing 8 months later where she had been told the record was finalized and had said nothing because she had been 29 years old and exhausted down to the marrow and had not yet understood what saying nothing would cost her. She was not 29 now. She spoke in the same flat, sequenced voice she'd always used for medical reporting. This happened, then this, because it was the most useful voice for this kind of material, and because she had learned a long time ago that the facts were more devastating than any emotional frame she could put around them. Wall asked precise questions. Olivia gave precise answers. Caldwell sat to her left and said nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have done. When it was over, Wall set her pen down and said, "I want to be direct with you about the timeline. The formal review process has no fixed endpoint. Depending on how the involved parties respond to the testimony and documentation, this could move quickly or it could extend over months." "I know that," Olivia said. "What I can tell you is that the record alteration, your removal from the official account of Hollow Pine, constitutes a falsification of a federal military record. That is not a classification issue. It is not a reporting ambiguity. It is a falsification, and the people who directed it will be addressed as falsifiers under the applicable statutes." Wall looked at her steadily. "Your name will be restored to that record. I can't give you a date, but I can tell you that is not in question." Olivia sat with that for a moment. Not the triumph of it. There wasn't triumph exactly, not yet, maybe not ever in the clean, uncomplicated way people imagined justice was supposed to feel. It was something quieter and more complex. The specific sensation of a weight that had been so constant you'd stopped feeling it as a weight, finally acknowledging its own presence by lifting. "There's something else I need to do today," she said, "before any of this becomes a public record or a media item or anything that travels through official channels." Wall nodded slowly, already understanding. "Ryan Whitfield's family." "Yes. I'd recommend sooner rather than later." Wall glanced at Caldwell. "The review is sealed for now, but these things don't stay sealed indefinitely, especially once multiple parties have legal representation involved." "I know." Olivia stood. "I'll go today." "But what?" The Whitfield family lived in Morganfield, a small city in western Kentucky that took 4 hours to reach by car. Caldwell drove. Olivia didn't argue about it. She was operating on 6 hours of sleep and the specific adrenaline plus exhaustion cocktail that kept you functional but made highways unwise. She spent the first hour of the drive on the phone with Price, who had been told about Voss's morning statement by Brask, and was processing it in the way of someone who had spent 5 years waiting for a door to open and was now standing in front of it trying to remember how hinges worked. "I didn't expect him to move that fast," Price said. "People move fast when they think someone else is moving faster," she said. He knew Fitch had the transmission logs. He decided the only play was to get to the IG first with a cooperative posture. "Does it matter who goes first? The outcome is the outcome regardless," she said. "But the shape of it changes depending on who cooperated and who was dragged." She watched the highway unroll ahead of them, flat and sunbright. Voss made himself a cooperating witness. That changes how he's charged, probably how he's sentenced. Whether that's just or not, she stopped. "I'm not the one who decides that." "Does it bother you?" Price asked. "That he might get less than he deserves because he talked?" She thought about it honestly. "It bothers me less than the alternative," she said. "The alternative is he stays quiet, the review drags out for 2 years, and the record stays wrong for longer." She paused. "I want the record corrected. I want Ryan's family to have the truth. If Voss getting a reduced characterization is the cost of getting there in months instead of years." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Price was quiet for a moment. "You're more pragmatic than I expected." "I've been waiting tables for 4 years," she said. "You learn to take what the table gives you and work with it." Something in Price's voice shifted. The first genuine approximation of a laugh she'd heard from him. "I'll call you when I hear from Brask," he said. She thanked him and hung up. Caldwell had been listening without pretending not to. "For what it's worth," he said, eyes on the road, "I think you're right." "About Voss?" "About all of it." He changed lanes smoothly. "You could have pushed for maximum accountability at maximum pace. Most people in your position would have. The record was taken from you. You didn't do anything wrong and you paid for it anyway." He glanced at her briefly. "But you're keeping the end game in view. The record corrected, the family informed. That's the thing that matters, and you're not letting the anger pull you off it." She considered that. "I'm angry," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. It's just not useful right now." "No," he said. "It's not." They drove the rest of the way mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way silence has become comfortable between people who have been through enough together in a short time that words feel like the less efficient option. The Whitfield house was a white two-story on a quiet street with a large oak in the front yard and a garden that had clearly been someone's project once and was now maintained out of habit rather than enthusiasm. Olivia and Caldwell sat in the car for a moment after pulling up. "Do you want me to come in?" Caldwell asked. She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "but stay back. Let me go first." He nodded. The woman who answered the door was in her mid-60s, with Ryan Whitfield's same dark eyes, and she looked at the two of them on her porch with the specific wariness of a person who had received bad news at a door before and had never entirely recovered from the anticipation of it. "Mrs. Whitfield," Olivia said. "My name is Olivia Hart. I was a Navy combat medic in 2018. I was present at the operation where your son died." She kept her voice steady and her eyes on the woman's face. "I'm here because there are things about that day that you were never told, and you deserve to hear them from someone who was there." The woman's hand on the door tightened slightly. She looked past Olivia to Caldwell, then back. "Come inside," she said. Ryan Whitfield's father, Gerald, came in from the backyard 10 minutes into the conversation, still in gardening gloves, and he sat down across from Olivia and his wife at the kitchen table and listened with the absolute stillness of a man who had spent 6 years holding grief in a particular shape and was now being told that the shape was wrong. She told them everything. Not everything at once. She moved through it carefully, reading their faces, pausing when she needed to, giving them time to absorb each thing before the next thing arrived. She told them about Ryan in the vehicle bay, the 40 seconds and what he'd said about dogs and honesty, and the wisdom that came from losing things. She could see it land on them, that detail, could see his mother press her hand flat on the table as though she needed the surface. She told them about the mission. She told them what Ryan did, the hand signals through active fire, the 11 minutes he held the eastern approach, the fact that when the secondary detonation happened, he was moving toward Titan and not away from anything, and that the last thing he did in a situation that allowed him choices was try to go back for his dog. Gerald Whitfield took his gardening gloves off. He set them on the table. He didn't say anything. She told them about the record. She told them that the training accident narrative was false, that the mission had been real and the courage had been real, and that a group of people in positions of authority had made a decision to protect themselves using a story that reduced their son's death to something it wasn't. She told them that this was wrong, that it had always been wrong, and that it was in the process of being corrected through a formal federal review that had opened the previous morning. And then she said, "Titan is alive." Ryan's mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He was listed as unrecovered," Olivia said. "He wasn't. I carried him out. He was placed with a veterans rescue program 3 years ago, and he found me." She stopped. "I don't know how else to describe it. He found me, and I've had him since." She looked at both of them. "He's in Washington right now, recovering from surgery. He's going to be okay." She paused. "I thought you should know that a piece of Ryan made it home." The kitchen was quiet. Gerald Whitfield looked at his hands on the table for a very long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but his voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had spent 60-plus years learning how to carry things. "He loved that dog," Gerald said. "More than... He talked about that dog like some people talk about family." "I know," Olivia said. "Titan talks about him too, just in the way dogs do." Something broke open in the room then. Not violently, but the way a window breaks when the pressure difference on either side has been building for too long. Sudden and clean, and followed by air. Ryan's mother, whose name was Carol, reached across the table and put her hand over Olivia's. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she did, her voice was very quiet. "Were you with him? At the end?" "For about 20 minutes, Olivia said. "He wasn't alone." Carol nodded, slowly absorbing that. "He was proud," she said. "Ryan. He was so proud of what he did. And we were told it was a training accident, and we couldn't put that together with the person we knew. We kept thinking we must have missed something, that we didn't know him as well as we thought." She squeezed Olivia's hand. "We knew him." "You knew him exactly right," Olivia said. Caldwell, who had been standing quietly near the doorway through the entire conversation, stepped forward. Then, he introduced himself to Gerald and Carol, and he told them that the formal correction of Ryan's record was a matter of when, not if, and that when it was corrected, it would reflect what had actually happened: his rank, his conduct, his actions under fire, and that he personally intended to ensure that correction was complete. Gerald Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. "Took 6 years," Gerald said. "Not accusatory, just a fact." "Yes, sir," Caldwell said. "It did." "I want to understand why." Gerald's voice was steady. "Not the bureaucratic why, the human why. Why somebody decided my son's death was something to be managed." Caldwell didn't look away. "Because the people who made that decision were protecting themselves. There's no better explanation than that. They were afraid of what the truth would cost them, and they calculated that it would cost them more than it would cost you." He paused. "They were wrong, and they're now in the process of finding out how wrong." Gerald looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at Olivia. "Will you bring the dog?" he asked. "When he's recovered enough to travel, will you bring him here?" "Yes," she said. "That was always going to be part of this." They drove back to Washington in the early evening, the sky going orange and flat ahead of them, and somewhere around the 2-hour mark, Olivia's phone showed a notification from the IG's office. A formal acknowledgement that her statement had been entered into the active review record, assigned a case reference number, and designated as primary testimony. She read it and set the phone on her knee. "Selby's attorney called Wall this afternoon," Caldwell said. He'd apparently gotten a notification of his own. "He's requesting a meeting." "Of course he is." "They're all going to talk now." He kept his eyes on the road. Once Voss moved, the calculation changed for all of them. Nobody wants to be the last one to cooperate. "What do you think happens to them?" she asked. "Realistically." He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man who knew how this machinery worked. "Voss loses his rank, almost certain. Administrative separation at minimum, possible criminal referral on the falsification count. Whether that results in prosecution depends on what his cooperation produces against Selby and Fitch." He paused. "Fitch and Selby are civilians now. The falsification of federal records carries real exposure. Selby especially. He gave the instruction that started all of it. His attorney requesting a meeting today means they know what Voss said this morning and they're trying to get ahead of it. He changed lanes. None of them walk away from this clean. They shouldn't. No, they shouldn't." He glanced at her. "They won't." She looked out the window at the passing landscape, highway and tree lines and the distant blue suggestion of a water tower, the ordinary geography of a country that had no idea this was happening inside it, which was how these things always went. The machinery of accountability moved in offices and conference rooms and federal buildings while the world outside continued at its own pace, unaware and uninterested, and that was fine. It didn't need to be a public spectacle. It needed to be real. That was the only thing she'd ever wanted from it. Not recognition, not vindication in the theatrical sense, just for the true thing to exist somewhere in the official record, next to the false thing, until the false thing had to give way. She was back at the NCVC by 8 in the evening. Ose met her at the entrance with an updated report she delivered while walking, the way veterinarians and doctors who were perpetually busy delivered information, in motion, efficiently, without softening the good news because it was good. Titan had eaten twice. His oxygen levels had been normal all day. His cardiac rhythm was showing the specific pattern of a heart that had been under pressure for a long time and was now, incrementally, learning to operate without that pressure. It would take time. 6 weeks of restricted activity, 3 months of monitoring, and then they would reassess. He keeps looking for you, Osei said with the plain matter-of-factness of someone reporting a clinical observation. Every time the door opens, he looks. Olivia didn't say anything. She went in. Titan heard her in the hallway. By the time she reached the recovery room, the tail was already going, and when she came through the door, he lifted his head fully for the first time since the surgery, properly, with effort, and held it there. She sat down beside the kennel on the floor, the same floor posture she'd been finding herself in for the past 36 hours, which said something about the week she'd had. And she put her hand through the door, and he pressed his face into her palm with the full deliberate weight of a dog who had been waiting. "Hi," she said. "I talked to them." He breathed against her hand. "Gerald wants to meet you." She rubbed the base of his ear. "When you're ready. When Dr. Osei says you can travel." She felt him lean. "You're going to like him. He grows things. He seems like the kind of person you'd pick." He exhaled, long and slow. She sat with him for a long time. She thought about the version of herself that had left the Navy 8 years ago, 29 and ground down to the wire, and certain that the only useful thing she could do was stop. She thought about the 4 years of early mornings and coffee orders, and the specific satisfaction of a clean section, and the specific numbness of a life designed to stay below the level of things that could hurt you. She thought about the night 3 years ago when she'd been in a bar in Galveston for her friend Dara's birthday, and a Belgian Malinois had crossed a room full of people and put his head on her knee and looked at her with the absolute certainty of an animal who has recognized something and is not interested in pretending otherwise. She had not gone looking for any of this. She had not woken up one morning and decided that the thing she was going to do was dismantle a 6-year institutional lie from the inside of an economy class seat. She had bought a cheap ticket and taken her dog to his medical appointment, and someone had told her to move, and she had moved, because she had always moved rather than fought. And then the dog she was moving for had stopped breathing, and she had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was to stop moving and get to work. That was, she thought, the thing nobody ever told you about strength. They talked about it like it was a posture, something you stood in, something you projected, something that announced itself. They didn't tell you that it mostly looked like just continuing to do the next thing, even when the next thing was undignified or exhausting, or involved crouching on the floor of an economy cabin at 30,000 feet with a borrowed oxygen mask and a dog who trusted you more than you'd ever felt you deserved. They didn't tell you that the person doing that was exactly the person they thought she wasn't. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, the IG's office issued a preliminary finding in the Hollow Pine Review. The finding ran to 43 pages. Olivia read it in Osei's break room with a cup of coffee she actually tasted, which felt like progress. The language was formal and specific, and almost entirely stripped of the emotional register of what it was actually saying, which was the bureaucratic way of saying true things that had been false for a long time. The falsification of the Hollow Pine after-action report was confirmed. The names of the reporting officers who directed the removal of key personnel and field accounts from the official record were named. The oversight notification failure was confirmed and attributed to a deliberate act of administrative concealment rather than procedural error. Warren Selby was identified as the originating authority for the concealment directive. Admiral Marcus Voss was identified as the implementing officer, with a finding of willful participation in the administrative falsification. Major General Alan Fitch's testimony had established the chain of instruction and had been assessed as credible by the investigation panel. On page 31, under the heading Record Corrections, the finding stated that the official record of the Hollow Pine operation was to be amended to include the full field account of the engagement, including the triage actions performed by then-active duty Navy combat medic Olivia C. Hart under hostile fire conditions, and that Hart's contributions to the survival of 3 personnel and 1 military working dog were to be formally documented in her service record. On page 32, the finding stated that the cause of death for Sergeant Ryan K. Whitfield was to be corrected from training accident to combat fatality in the line of duty, and that his service record was to be amended accordingly, including formal documentation of his actions during the final phase of the engagement. On page 33, there was a short paragraph about Titan, K9 Unit Titan, military working dog, Handler Sergeant Ryan K. Whitfield, confirming that the animal had been successfully recovered from the field following the engagement and had been placed in approved civilian care, and that his status in the official record was to be amended from unrecovered to survivor, field recovered, subsequently retired to civilian placement. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she set the coffee down and sat for a moment with her eyes on the wall of the break room. Plain white, slightly scuffed, a motivational poster about teamwork that someone had hung at a slight angle and nobody had ever fixed. And she breathed. Caldwell called at 10:30. "You've seen the finding," he said. "Yes." Voss accepted administrative separation yesterday. His retirement is being processed under the revised characterization. The finding goes into his file. He keeps his pension, but the rank is gone. He paused. Selby's attorney entered a plea agreement with the DOJ this morning. He's cooperating fully. Fitch's situation is more complicated because of the falsified transmission claim. There are competing versions of events that need to be reconciled. But the finding is clear enough that he has no viable defense for the concealment directive. "What does cooperating fully mean for Selby?" she asked. "Probably supervised release and significant fines rather than custodial time given his age and the cooperation." His voice was even. "I know that's not—" "It's what it is," she said. "The record is corrected. Ryan's file is corrected. Titan is a survivor in the official record." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Caldwell said. "It's everything that matters." There was a pause between them. "The Navy's JAG office called me this morning," he said. "There's a formal recognition ceremony being planned for the personnel from Hollow Pine, including the corrections to Ryan's record. They want you present." "I'll be there." "And there's a Medal of Commendation recommendation that's been submitted for your actions during the engagement." He was quiet for a moment. "I submitted it. I should tell you that directly." She was quiet. "You don't have to accept it," he said. "I know." She looked at the slightly crooked poster on the wall. "I'll accept it." 6 weeks after the surgery, on a Saturday in early autumn when the air had gone from summer's heaviness to something clearer, Olivia drove to Morganfield with Titan in the back seat. He had his head out the window for most of the drive, which Osei had not technically approved but had not technically prohibited, and his ears went back in the wind and his eyes half closed with the specific expression of an animal who has decided this is exactly where he is supposed to be. Gerald Whitfield was in the front yard when they pulled up. He was doing something to the oak tree, trimming a low branch, it looked like, and when the car stopped, he set the clippers down and came toward the curb, and he stopped when Titan climbed carefully out of the back seat and stood in the driveway in the autumn light. Gerald looked at the dog for a long moment. Titan looked back. His tail moved, careful and deliberate, the way it moved when he was deciding something. Then he walked forward, slowly, the slight hitch in his step that would always be there, and he crossed the 3 feet of driveway and pressed his head against Gerald Whitfield's hand. Gerald Whitfield put his hand on the dog's head and stood there, and he was quiet for a long time. And Olivia stayed where she was by the car, because there are some moments that don't belong to you, and this was one of them. Carol came out of the house. She stopped on the porch steps and saw her husband's hand on the dog's head, and she sat down on the steps and watched, and her face did the complicated human thing that faces do when something they have been mourning unexpectedly shows up in a form they can touch. Olivia leaned against the car. She had spent 4 years making herself as small and uncomplicated as possible. She had learned to be grateful for smallness, had told herself it was a choice she was making freely, had built a life out of shifts and routines and the careful avoidance of anything that required her to be the person she had been trained to be. And maybe that was necessary for a while. Maybe you needed the years of plain coffee orders and wiping down tables and leaving it all at the door. Maybe the smallness was the only thing that let the wound close enough to scar. But she was done being small. Not because anyone had told her to stop, not because the record was corrected or because there was a ceremony scheduled or because she was owed something. She was done because she had spent 36 hours on the floor of an aircraft and in a surgery waiting room and at a kitchen table in Kentucky. doing the things she'd been trained to do, being exactly who she was, and the world had not ended. The world had in fact been better for it. That was the thing about quiet strength. It wasn't about waiting to be seen. It wasn't about earning recognition through suffering or performing sacrifice loud enough that someone finally noticed. It was about knowing what you were made of in the moments when nobody was watching, and then continuing to be that thing even when the cost was high and the record was wrong and the seat you deserved had been given to someone else. You didn't need the seat. You knew what you were. The rest was just paperwork. Gerald looked up from the dog and found her eyes across the driveway. He nodded once, a small nod, the specific nod of a man who has no more words for something and doesn't need them. She nodded back. Titan sat down at Gerald's feet in the autumn sun, and he looked out at the street with the calm attention of a dog who has finally arrived somewhere, and his tail moved slow and steady against the ground like something being laid to rest. Not grief, not loss, not the ending of a thing, the settling of one.